Good evening, everybody. I see so many people out there. I can't believe it. Why did my laptop just change to me?
Because we want to see your face.
Because we wanted everybody to see who you were, who was talking to them.
Okay, but it's on the phone too. So anyway, hello, and thank you all for coming. I wanted to thank Pat Way and Michelle George for asking me to do this. And also Pat and Michelle and Joe and Carol and Leslie. None of this stuff happens by itself. And we've spent the last couple of days ironing out little bugs. Like, for starters, I needed a better webcam. And so we've gotten this all together, and I appreciate all of your help. And before Carol was, you said what she just said, I wanted to thank you, Carol, for all of the work that you've done on the board. And I was going to bring that up. And in the fall of 2016, at Lindsay Dirks Brown, you came around with your sheath of papers and said, hey, why don't you join the board? And I am just absolutely happy that I did. And again, to repeat what you said, we do have openings on the board. And so if people would like to join a fun group of people, do good things with watercolor, we would welcome that. So anyway, today we're going to talk about beginning watercolor. And I'm a little puzzled why I see so many faces out there that are way more than beginners, but that's okay. I'm going to raise this up.
Michael, I've got your desktop spotlighted now.
Good, thank you. So I should say later on this little thing that's telling me to unmute the laptop.
Right.
This is what I call my intro sheet. And so I've been teaching in Mill Valley for the last 6 years. And just recently at Falkirk Cultural Center in San Rafael, we haven't been able to meet in Mill Valley since March. You all know why. And so whenever we have somebody new come into the class, I get the class going on what they're going to do, and then announce that I will take the new person or persons over to the corner table to give them the introduction to the class and the kinds of things that we cover. And that's what this old sheet of paper is. And I always say, if any of you would like to come over and get a review of this stuff, you're more than welcome. And 9 times out of 10, when I look around, there's 5 or 6 people standing there. So people seem to want to review these basics. And it's kind of what we're here to do tonight, because I see a lot of people that are certainly not beginners. But for those of you who are, we're going to talk about our materials and how we paint and how we draw and color and design and composition and values. Let's start with materials. We have water. That's easy enough. Here on planet Earth, we're lucky to have water. It's the thing that makes this place livable. We have paint, watercolor paper, and brushes. And watercolor paper comes in tubes and in pans. And this is a little pan kit that somebody gave me. I prefer to work with tubes. I just find they're much easier to work with. You can squeeze out large amounts of color if you have big washes or are working on a larger painting. I just don't enjoy having to pick up the color in these. Basically what the pan colors are the same color, the same paint, but squeezed out into these little plastic boxes and allowed to dry. So those are pans. So watercolor paint comes in artist grade, professional paint, and student grade. And obviously the difference is that student grade is considerably less expensive. The difference is obviously that there's less pigment in student grade and more binder. The binder of watercolor paint is largely gum arabic. There are some other things that certain companies put into their paints, but basically it's powdered pigment, the colors we use, and gum arabic. And so student grade paint has less, not that much, but a little bit less pigment in it. This is Grumbacher Academy. This is Cotman, which is from Winsor and Newton. And this is Talon's company. They have a line called Van Gogh. So here's a list of artist grade watercolors. Winsor and Newton from England, M. Graham Company from Portland area. Daniel Smith is from Seattle. Da Vinci is in Southern California. Holbein is a Japanese company. Utrecht is made in New York. It's now owned by Blick. Sennelier is a French company. Core is a newcomer to the watercolor paints. This is a company, this is from the Golden Artist Company, who also has sponsored one of our awards in the National this year. And Schminke is a company in Germany. M. Graham and Sennelier, both in addition to gum arabic, put honey in their colors. And their claim is that it makes them not dry out as much and re-wet more readily if and when they do. So I have a couple. So here are student grade paints. Cotman is made by Winsor and Newton. Grumbacher Academy is here, we've talked about, and then Van Gogh. And I have a couple little asterisks by Van Gogh because I've used this paint with my students, and we've all found it to be really quite good compared to some of the other student grades. And I actually called the company and asked them, is it artist grade or student grade? And I could almost hear them smile through the phone. And they said that it's somewhere right between the two, and that they're proud to put more pigment in these student grade colors than others do. So that's a little bit about paints. I think if you're beginning with watercolor, you would be fine to use student grade paint for a while. I'll have something different to say about that when we talk about paper. Watercolor paper comes in 3 finishes and 3 weights. There is a term in the paper world called a ream, and a ream means 500 sheets of paper. That's across the board in printing and all kinds of things, and the watercolor papers have adhered to it. So 500 sheets is a ream of paper, and we measure the weight of the paper that way. So when you go to Staples or Office Depot and you buy a package of paper for your printer, you're buying a ream of paper, and it's called 20-pound bond. It weighs 20 pounds. Watercolor paper comes in 3 weights. If you had 500 sheets of the thinnest paper, it would weigh 90 pounds. If you had 500 sheets of the next weight of paper, it would weigh 140 pounds. And if you had 500 sheets of the thickest paper, it would weigh 300 pounds. Watercolor paper comes in 3 finishes. Hot press is very smooth. It's a bit like this. This is just drawing paper from an 18 by 24 inch drawing pad. And it has almost no tooth. We call the texture of paper the tooth. And this is quite smooth. I can't feel the texture when I run my fingers over it. Hot press watercolor paper is very similar. It's used a lot in things like illustration. Some people paint with it as well. There is a more textured paper. So if you look at this line, if you could look at a piece of watercolor paper from the edge with a microscope, you would see that it's made of little hills and valleys. That is its texture or its tooth. And we take advantage of that, certainly with things like dry brush and in other areas when we have granulating paint that settles into the valleys of the paper. So cold pressed paper has a tooth. We can feel it when we run our fingers over it. Let me get a piece. We can feel the texture, the tooth. I don't know if you can see that, but you would maybe see the little valleys in the hills in there. We use that to our advantage. And then there's another paper called rough press that has an even more pronounced tooth. And so that's a bit about watercolor paper. Now, I've seen many times students begin to paint in our class with student grade paper. I really recommend that you buy artist grade paper. The student grade paper really works against you. It doesn't take a wash anywhere near like a good artist grade watercolor paper does. So not to, here's a list of 100% cotton content watercolor papers. So watercolor paper is made from the fibers of the cotton plant, a few other things, but primarily that. And it's 100% cotton content and has a sizing in it. Student grade papers are made from wood pulp. This paper here is a wood pulp paper. Most papers made from wood pulp. Watercolor paper is made from cotton content. And so the sizing and the material that it's made from are the things that give it the beautiful finish that when we put paint on it. And so here's a list of manufacturers of watercolor paper, cotton content. Arches from France, Winsor & Newton in England, Fabriano from Italy, Hahnemühle from Germany, Lanaquarelle, France again, Kilimanjaro, I'm not quite sure where it's made. Watman is a British paper, and Saunders Waterford, also a British company. Fluid 100 is a new one that I found in researching this. I don't know much about them. I'm assuming it's somewhere here in the States. So that is a little bit about watercolor paper. So then with all of this, we say, well, how do we put this stuff on paper? How do we put watercolor on paper? And there are really only 4 ways to do that. And they have to do with whether the paper is wet or dry and how wet or dry the brush is. And when we use these terms about watercolor, and it's a little misleading because when we talk about dry paper, yes, it can be dry. There's no moisture on it. When we talk about wet paper, it can be either really wet, soaking wet, or it can be moist. And so I missed talking about one other thing, which I said I would cover. Going back to paper a little bit, watercolor paper comes in sheets. They're 22 by 30 inches, and it comes in blocks. A block is 20 sheets of paper that's fastened together by a black gummy tape. It's like when you have a pad of papers that you tear one off. It's sealed on all 4 sides like that. There's a little area at the top, a little area that's not sealed where you can get a little palette knife or a pocket knife in there to cut away the paper. Personally, I don't like using these, but people give them to me sometimes. Even when I get them, I take the pages off and I stretch them. I stretch my paper. I find that it gives me the best surface to paint on. And so with a block, if you have a small block, they come 10 by 14, and I think even a little smaller. And those small block sizes, if you get a pretty wet wash on them, they'll be okay. But if you get up to something like this, which is 14 by 20 inches, and you get a big wash on here, I've not found that these little black glued edges are strong enough to keep it from buckling. So I'm not a fan of these. As I said, I take the paper off and stretch it and staple it to my board. And that here's an example of that. This is a quarter sheet. It's 11 by 15 inches, and it's been stretched. And so to stretch the paper, what I do is I put it in the sink, a little sheet like this anyway, or the tub if it's a big full or half sheet. And I just turn on a little trickle of water, and I just rock the paper under the water, letting it get completely covered, both sides. And you'll feel that watercolor paper go from this kind of snap that it has, this is 140-pound paper, to feeling like a piece of cloth, because it's essentially that's what it is. And you just leave it that way for a couple of minutes. And the paper, as it gets wet, it expands. It's not something we can see, but it stretches. And then I just let all the water drip off of it. And then I open a stapler, and all around the edges, about every 2 inches, I bump in a staple. You can see that here. And you can see where sometimes if I'm too close to the edge, the staple can pull away. But by and large, it gives me a really nice stretch. It's like a drum head. and I can feel the paper about a 16th, maybe 32nd of an inch before it hits the wood. So it's really like a drum head, and you can get a lot of wash on here, a lot of water, and it won't buckle. Even if it does buckle a little bit, it still will dry back to this flat shape. So I prefer it over blocks, and I just thought I would talk to you about that. Is the way that I do it. So when we talk about what are the 4 ways that we put watercolor paint on paper, here they are. And I've done these, and I can, let's see, I'll move which way. This webcam is a bit like driving a boat. You turn one way and it goes the other way. Okay. So wet on wet, when we wet the paper with clear water, at first, that water is floating on the surface. So when we do wet into wet, the 2 most difficult ways to control watercolor are when the paper is moist or the paper is really wet. So when we put clear water on the paper, that water is really floating on the surface of the paper. And if we touch a brush with color to that, it just goes, it just disperses in the water. And we cede all control of what's going to happen in terms of a shape or even the color if we're mixing a couple. Sometimes that might be fine for certain instances if we want to do it in a sky or something like that. And so the water is really on the surface of the paper, and the look of it is very glossy, it's very shiny. If we wait a few minutes, the water is then in the paper. It's absorbed into the paper, and the color, the surface of it, rather than being very glossy, is sort of a satiny. It's a dull finish. And we have to gauge that. It's a little bit of a difficult thing to get used to. And then, of course, it depends on the humidity. And if you're outside or if you're in the sun, you don't want to do it in the sun. But gauging when to put your brush to paper is the trickiest part. And so here we see wet onto wet, where I wet the paper. I can do it if you want me to. Let me see here. So if I wet the paper, it's very wet. I'll wet a little area. And I will give it some cobalt blue. I can look at it on an angle and see that it's very shiny. It's really wet. So the paper has not yet begun to be absorbed into the paper, and it just goes where it wants to go. It had that few seconds to become a little absorbed. You can see in this one where it went all the way to the edge of the little shape that I made. Now, if we wet the paper here, and I'm going to try to be patient and let it be absorbed into the paper a little bit. And then we can paint a shape that will be soft edged, but will still retain its shape. And that's something that we can use to our advantage for distant things, a distant hillside, something that's in the fog, things that we don't want to be too evident, that we want to take the reader's attention away from. So I'm going to wait. I'm going to try to be patient. In the meantime, I'll show you something different so that we have something to do. Here is, let's do dry, wet on dry. So wet on dry means we have a brush that's wet, moist, and we have color in it. and it's the most direct application of painting with watercolor. The paper is dry. The brush has color and water in it, sort of a middle value, and we can just paint. Too much water in it. We can just paint whatever we want. So very simply, we're just painting whatever comes to mind. Little fishing shacks. And I'm watching this. It's not ready yet. So I'm waiting and entertaining you.
Michael, what
Yes.
tells you when it's ready? What does it look like?
It's not glossy. It's got no shine to it. I know it's hard for you to see that. I have to get at a pretty strong angle to the side to see it. And it loses its shine. It's a little difficult to know when it's ready. I've messed it up numerous times when I've gone in and it wasn't. So the water needs to be absorbed enough that you can paint on it and have your shape be soft edged and not too fuzzed out. And if it's too dry, then not, it's not soft edge. Let's see.
Michael, can you
Yes.
pull your paper close to your chest on the
My
table
what?
so it's right? Your paper that you're working on, bring it close to your chest, then I can see. No, bring it close to you. Bring it right to the edge of the table. Pull your sheet of paper right to the edge of the table next to your chest.
If you have the bar of people on the top of your screen, you can change it by touching it and choosing the little tiny square, and that turns it into a little square so it goes away from, and then you can see the full screen. So you just have to move the strip of people that are above there.
I do.
Yeah, with the forward or back arrows.
Get rid of the people. I'm trying to share the screen.
If you can't see what's on the very top of the screen because the list of the people are in the way, then you can make that smaller by clicking on it and choosing the little shapes on the top left to make that area smaller.
It's just that his paper is too far away from his chest. If it were
I can
right,
see it perfectly fine.
It looks fine to me too.
It looks fine to me too.
Looks fine to me.
I think it looks
Fine to me
perfect.
too.
I'm okay.
That is focused right there.
Okay, so we can see here that the paper was just moist and I used a brush that was not too wet. It had color and water in it, but it was not too wet. And so I'm able to put marks down that are soft and diffused, but still retain their shape. And so this is a technique that we can use, and it's very helpful and handy. And so that's that one. So here we have dry, wet on dry, wet on wet, dry on wet. Dry meaning the brush is not too soaking, has color and water in it. And then this one, we want to starve the brush, meaning we want to wick away this way excess moisture. So the brush should be really quite dry. It's got color and water in it, but it's been starved of moisture. And the brush then where normally we hold the brush like this or back here. In this case, we want to hold the brush at the back of it, behind it. Our fingers should be behind it. And we just skip it over the texture of the paper. So dry brush technique is where we just let the brush that's been starved of moisture go over the hills and valleys of the paper that we just talked about to get a dry brush mark. So it can be used for leaves in a tree, that kind of thing.
What did you dry your brush on?
I put it on this is a moist kitchen sponge, a cellulose sponge, something that I'm going to talk more about. It's very important in what we do here. And I touch the back ferrule of the brush, or I often do it with a paper towel. So if I want my brush to be really dry, I touch the back of the bristles right by the ferrule to a paper towel or even to my sponge, and it will wick away the excess moisture. And so then holding the brush just parallel to the paper, we can just skip along the tops of the hills and not get down into the valleys that this does or that this does, and create dry brush marks. If I need to go back and get some more color, I can wick away that moisture again, and we can make little leaves in a tree, which we can then paint into trunks and other things. Do you see? So wet onto wet, the color just takes off wherever it wants to go when the paper is really wet. And then wet onto dry, easy, the very most straightforward way to paint with watercolor. Dry brush, medium dry brush on moist paper, we can soften edges like these things. And then dry brush, we can take advantage of the texture. And so all of these things put together and in combination give us the kinds of marks that we want to make to build a painting with a lot of variety in it. The next thing let's do is work on putting down clean, clear washes. So here's a wash about a middle dark value of cobalt blue. And here's one that's gradated. And here's one where we're going to talk about softening edges. So to do this, I need to put my paper at a bit of an angle. I'm going to get this roll of tape. And let me mix up some more color. When we do this, we want to mix up a nice big puddle of color. It's always better to have color left over if you're making a wash rather than to run out in the middle of the wash. Because if you run out in the middle of the wash and you have to go back to the wells and remix, you're going to get in trouble because that color on the paper is going to begin to be absorbed. And if you come back and try to catch your wash, you will more than likely have a blossom or a line there. So when we paint a direct, simple wash, we want to have a bead form at the bottom of the shape that we're making, meaning we want to have a lot of color and water in the brush. And there's the bead. So any shape that we make in watercolor is a wash. If it's anything more than a single stroke, we refer to it as making a wash to create a shape, even if it's a simple square like this one. And so we want that bead to form at the bottom, and to get an even wash, we overlap that bead and just carry it along. And we want to just let the brush feel like it's just barely touching the paper and releasing the paint. This summer in my class, a number of people really struggled with this simple thing of laying down a wash. And when we looked into it, we realized that they were really pushing down hard on their brush and they were getting strokes in their wash. And so we want to just let this brush just touch the paper and feel as though all it's doing is releasing the color that wants to be there. And we can just take this thing on down and down and down. Wanted to make sure I wasn't messing up that wet paint on the side. So we can form this shape just as we did up here. You know, in a lot of ways, this was no different. It's just creating that shape with a brush full of color on dry paper. So that's how we do that. And if there's any color left over at the end of the wash, we can just take a brush, take all the moisture out of it. You might see that there's a little blob here that formed at the corner, and we can pick that up with a brush that's dried just by touching the paint and not the paper. Just soak it up. I messed up. That's okay. That's okay. It's evening out. So that's how we do a wash that is simple, one color, one value, and even. Now, if we want to do a wash that is, I hope you're going to be able to see this. If we want to do a graded wash, we would start the same way. Get that bead of water, whoops. And we can even out the shape if we need to. And we refer to this as keeping the wet edge moving. So we want to keep the wet edge moving along. Now I have a big bead. I can just carry it along, almost too big. And then if we want to begin to make it graded, this one is not perfect. Then what we want to do is take the brush and just dip it gently into the water, and it will release color and take on water. And we can just touch it to the edge of the container, and we'll see the color go out of the brush. And then we, again, want to go over that bead, and it will be a little lighter. And then we just do the same thing, just touch it gently into the container, just touch the corner, the edge of the container. We're releasing water, releasing color and taking on water. And again, and we get this thing to grade 8 to a lighter value. And again, and we can just make it lighter and lighter. We can speed it up if we push against the side of the container a little bit more to release more water. And down it goes. And then if we want the bottom of that to be white paper, we can release all the paint into the water cup. Even let it get a little bit, touch the sponge, and then just touch the edge of it with the brush having nothing in it but clear water, and we can soften the edge. Often we have shapes that we make at any time that we want to have soft edges on. So we might have a shape in a painting at any time that we want to soften the edge on. And so again, we can release the color from the brush, and with clear water, just touch an edge to soften it. And so we use these things to get variety in our paintings, soft edges and hard edges, soft against hard. In addition to all of these ways that we've described, we use softening edges quite a bit. And that's how we do it. We just touch the brush to the wet edge and soften them. These don't have any particular meaning right now, but in the process of making a painting, they can be ways to soften edges. So those are the 4 ways that we put watercolor on paper. And I'll go put this back up for a second. Like I say, it's a bit like driving a boat. I'm not good at driving boats. So I skipped over talking about brushes. When I have my materials list, I recommend to people to just buy a 1-inch chisel brush for laying down big washes and a number 12 round. That gets people started. And then if they decide to continue, they can do like most of us and end up with more brushes than they could possibly ever use. But that's what ends up happening. Somehow we can't seem to escape from the art supply store without buying another brush. And these are the ones that I have currently I'm using. I favor using round brushes personally. I think flat brushes are certainly good and have their place for painting architectural things, obviously, but I like the more expressive marks that you can get with round brushes. And I like these, they're very coarse hair. I think it's goat hair, it could be ox hair, I can't remember. It's called a hake, and this is a bamboo brush. And these give you really good dry brush marks because they're very coarse. And so I like to use those, and with quick motions, you can get dry brush marks. This little carrier, you've probably all seen these. I have generally keep a piece of very rough sandpaper in mine, in case I want to get texture on something. So here we can see an instance where, I hope you can see it, where I scrape the paper with the rough sandpaper, and then just by painting the tree trunk, it has a sort of an instant bark to it. And so that's sometimes a handy thing to have. And here I keep a single edge razor blade taped up there for scraping out. Sometimes you want to scrape out the telephone lines or things like that. With the corner of a single edge blade, you can do that.
Hey, Michael, can I ask, are you scraping the paper before you paint it, or while the paint is wet?
Before.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
scrape the paper with the sandpaper. It's also good for things like rust on boats, old boats, that kind of thing. So you scrape the paper, take away the sandpaper that spills out of there, and then you paint your tree. Who asked that? Who is that?
Michael, this is Evan Hughes.
Hey, Evan, how you doing?
Great. So glad to jump in on this.
Thank you. So then you look for where you made that mark and you paint your tree. These are good at Yosemite, and you have instant bark. What's next? Drawing. Drawing is really so important. It can't be overstated. And
Michael,
yes.
before you move on, are there any particular brands of brushes that you recommend?
Yeah, these are from a company called Silver. The series is called Black Velvet, and I really like them. I've had this one for a long, long time. I had to patch it together with 5-minute epoxy where it began to come apart. I don't even remember where I got it. It might have been the Palo Alto art store. They're hard to find, but there's a website called brushguys.com in Southern California that carries them. And they have the whole line. So there's a line within the, where'd the other one go? I have another one that's just a regular round, but this is a regular round. It's an 18, 16. And this other line, so there's still the company Silver Black Velvet, but within that line of brushes, there's this 3-brush, I don't know what you call it, line of brushes, and they're called jumbo round. So they have a really fat belly and are longer than regular rounds. And I just like them. This is the smallest of them. This is the middle one. And if you buy the big one, it's like a baseball bat. It's just too big, but they're very nice. Princeton makes a very nice brush, the Neptune series. This is a brush. I have two of these. I have not seen one in a very long time, but for a flat brush, I really enjoy this. It's made by Grumbacher. I've had it for a really long time. It's a 5/8, but unlike many of the flat brushes, it's got a longer bristles. You can actually see some of them are worn off. And I like them for what they do. I like mops, quills, especially these things for laying in a really big wash. They're very nice. This is a Winsor & Newton, and it's a number 8. The quill brushes have a whole different way of being classified. This is a 2/0. I've just gotten this recently, and it takes a bit of getting used to because the quill brushes hold so much water, especially this huge one. And whereas this is such a small brush, and I got it because I thought I could do very fine work with it, and I kind of can. It has a great point, but because they carry so much water, it's a thing I'm getting used to. I've just had it for maybe 2 months. And Black Velvet also makes a very fine brush that I use on occasion for finishing up paintings, detail things. So a big mop really covers a lot of paper. Oh, and I have a toothbrush that I keep in here that I sometimes use to splatter. I'll put some paint in here and then splatter onto either wet paint. If you splatter really hard, you can get that kind of texture. And so sometimes if I have a wash that's down here and is moist, I can splatter in another color and these little dots will diffuse and mingle and make a nice texture. And sometimes I'll splatter onto a dry wash. So I keep a toothbrush in there for the occasional splatter. I've kind of given up on using salt to add textures. It's just such a brutal mark that it leaves behind, but I do use the spritzer bottle. So if I make a wash and I want to get some texture in it, I can just spritz it. And the little droplets that come out, aerosols, the thing nobody wants anymore, they leave behind a texture. If you can even see it, I think here in the wet watercolor, and it'll dry like that. So just a little spritz from that thing can make a nice texture.
Michael, somebody else wanted to know what size of sandpaper you use.
Oh, I don't know. It's really rough. Let me see.
Very rough sandpaper then. Okay.
It's really rough. I mean, I'll find out and I'll put that on. So I have a blog and I'm going to put a lot of this information on there. And I'll show you how to find the blog at the end, but I'll have a lot of this stuff on there that people can revisit along with the video and, you know, and kind of look into these things in detail. You see here what the spritzer did with those, and that's just on the palette. So let's talk about drawing. As I said, I just can't overstate the importance of drawing. I mean, when we make a watercolor, we're really making a colored drawing with our brushes. And so being able to draw, if you're going to paint representationally, being able to draw what you want to paint is really important. And in addition to drawing, I mean, with pencils or other things, I really stress for myself and so for my students that we really learn to draw with the brush, because again, that's what we're doing when we're making a watercolor. I try to make as few pencil marks as I can on watercolor paper. So if there's a building, obviously I'm going to draw it, or a car or thing like that, figures. But most of the things in nature, I like to not draw them, but paint them with the brush. Trees, bushes, fences, whatever. I would rather have those marks be spontaneous and fluid and drawn with the brush directly, as opposed to drawing the tree and then filling it in. And so one of the things that I do when I feel like I need to get some drawing exercises, I go out with these 18 by 24 inch sheets of paper, and pencils are not allowed on the expedition. I take the tube of black paint, 2 or 3 brushes, and I find some place in my neighborhood that stops me, and I make a drawing in grayscale. But I thought first that I would show you this quote that I found, and I really like it. I think it's amusing. This guy says, when my daughter was about 7 years old, she asked me one day what I did at work. I told her that I worked at the college, that my job was to teach people how to draw. She stared back at me incredulous, and she said, you mean they forget? And so that's kind of interesting because all kids draw. And obviously this kid had the, that this sort of shock of, well, what do you mean you don't know how to draw? And so it's something that a lot of people let go of. And I am convinced that everybody can learn to draw to some degree, relearn, I should say, because we all did it when we were kids. So anyway, I go out with my black paint, 2 or 3 brushes and a palette, and I just find something that stops me and I begin to draw. And very often when I do that, it's at the edge of a building. And so I want to have a straight line. So I draw that line. Now, once I've drawn that line, then everything else in the whole, let's call it painting, is about relative proportion and location and size and angle to that first thing. You first commit to this length of a line and you build from it. And so what's the little eave? It's about a 45-degree angle and it goes out that far and then up here to the roof. So if this is this long, then how long will this roof be? And it's a relative thing that you can measure. You can put your pencil out. You've seen people with their pencil out, like, how can I have you see this? Their pencil out and they mark off by their thumb the distance that one thing is to another. And you can do that. You can also do it this way, where you hold your pencil or brush to this and you say, if this is this distance, then what is that distance? It's about 2 of them. And you can kind of gauge that. But once you've done it for a while, you make these visual judgments. You work toward making these visual judgments, and everything becomes relative to the first mark you put down. And so you build this thing up and you build it up. If this is this long, then that's just not quite as long, and that's almost as long. And the angles, you measure them with your eye. It's a hand-eye thing until you get to the edge of the paper. And, so they're a really good exercise to do. And so, you want to learn to get the brush, to learn the facility of making the brush make these kinds of marks that say that they're leaves or pine trees or magnolia bush or whatever, a chimney. And so without any pre-drawing, it's a very good exercise in drawing skills, learning to control and get that hand-eye coordination, and also in learning the facility of how can the brush say this little house in Mill Valley or this little Victorian in San Rafael and all of its bushes and things. And you really walk away with a lot of information. You could turn these into colored paintings, either from the color that's around there or make your own color. So I really stress that people should do that and large. You want to hold your brush toward the back and you want to paint with your whole arm, and you can get a much freer feeling. If people can't or don't want to go out, there's nothing that says you can't draw the things that are around you. These are things that were sitting on my desk one day. But drawing directly with the brush without pre-drawing will really build that skill. So color. We never really finish talking about color. It's just something that we work on and that comes up over and over and over. We're going to go through color theory and a couple other things about it, but it's a conversation that really does and should go on forever. These two things are really so interconnected values, and design and composition. And so once we're capable to control paint, we know the fundamentals, we've worked on our drawing, and we can execute a painting, and we're getting more and more comfortable with it. Then we get into design and composition, and we do that with values largely, not only, but largely. And so these two things are very much tied together. The values that we make have a lot to do with where we put the viewer's eye and how, with the principles of design, making compositions. And then all of these things come, I should say, these things, feelings, emotion, and viewpoint, feed into these things. So if 10 of us go out to make a painting, chances are we're all going to come back with a different painting almost completely. I paint with a group of people in the summer, and we all go out and everybody finds something else for the most part. And those are just about us. What are our feelings, our emotions, viewpoint? What are the things that tickle us to say, oh, I want to paint that? And then once we've gotten that hook to make a painting of a given thing, here or whatever, then they feed into how we compose it. And so those are the things that we cover in the class, the basic fundamentals of materials and how we get paint on paper, stressing drawing, talking about color, and then just having fun making paintings using these things. Let me look at my list and see what am I doing next. Shape sheet. Are there any questions at this point? Nope.
What was the name of the brush company that you talked about? And excuse me, the silver black velvet with the big belly. What was the name of it?
So the brush company is called thebrushguys.com. It's a website. And the brushes are Silver is the company. It's a Japanese company. Here they're headquartered in Princeton, New Jersey, or someplace like that. So Silver is the company, and the line of brushes are called Black Velvet, and they have rounds. They also have chisel brushes, flat brushes, but then there's that little 3-brush series called Jumbo Round. There's a small, a medium, and a large. And
thank you. That's what I missed was the jumbo rounds. Thank you so much.
From brushguys.com. What was I going to do? Oh, the shape sheet. Shape sheet. This is a sheet that I give my students in the first day, and it's just made up of random shapes that I made. And this is, again, to stress the idea of learning to draw with the brush, directly on the paper with the brush. So I made up these random shapes, and I built in a little bit of difficulty just to make them challenging. In each one where there's an arrow and an open area, then the idea is to soften that edge, as we saw in that board. Where did I put it? To soften an edge so that it bleeds out to clear, to white paper. And so these are meant to, like the other things, to build drawing skills and seeing. And so we can paint these shapes directly. I urge people to do it without pre-drawing with a pencil. And so it's a challenge to figure out, what are these angles? How does this thing work? I did this one the other day. I've done these many times. I can do it if you want, or we can move on. But the point is that they're a challenge for them to learn how to draw directly with the brush, and also, very important, to keep the wet edge moving. Maybe we should do one. Let me get a little smaller brush. Get my jumbo round. Let's see here. What color should we make it? Okay, so doing this shape again. We want to gauge the angles, and you can put down these little points to help yourself kind of orient to it. And so if I see that angle, I begin to build it up. Kind of goes about like that. Now, I don't want to make it the whole length that it is yet, because what I want to do is to build the shape up, keeping the wet edge moving, build it up as a shape, not as an outline that I fill in. If I was to outline this with the brush as a line and fill it in, by the time I got to fill it in, the linear part would have dried, and I would have been able to see that it was two things hitched together. So if I keep the wet edge moving, I can build it as a single simple shape, just like this. This one's easier. This one's a challenge. Can you all see? So I keep the wet edge moving and I build this up. So this is going to come out to about there. Let's say that far. And I come back and keep the wet edge moving. And then I have to gauge how far this one comes down relative to that one, just like the roof of that little boatyard. What is one thing relative to the next? So I bring this down to about where it feels right. I keep the wet edge moving so it doesn't dry up on me. And I have a challenge on my hands. And that's why I did them this way. And this comes out not at a 90-degree angle, but a little bit of an angle. So I see what it ought to be. And I keep the wet edge moving here. I think I'm about as far down as I need to go here, so I can keep this wet edge moving. It's a little bit more of an angle maybe. So we're measuring all the time. And then this distance relative to that again is what? I'd say about that. Keep the wet edge moving, don't let it dry. And then this little piece comes out at a little bit of an arc. Why did I make it so hard? About an arc like that. No, a little bit more. It's constant measuring. And then it begins to come down. That angle relative to that one. About like that. Now I got to keep the wet edge moving. So I'm constantly going back and forth. And now I can begin this arc. Keeping the wet edge moving and making sure that the color I mixed up in the puddle is going to be enough for me to finish the shape. Making the arc and bringing this down here. So you see how we're building this up completely, inside and outside, line and fill at once. And that's how we get it to be even. It's actually a little further down, so the arc can come down here. So that's the exercise. And when people do these, it's a challenge, but you know, how else are you going to learn? And so there are all kinds of different shapes. But what we find is that when we get over here toward the end, we see something that we recognize. Oh, that kind of looks like it could be a tree. And then we get over here and we're making this shape and we say, well, that could be a hill. And it comes down and then we paint around this thing. Oh, it looks like a house. And so here we have the introduction to negative painting. In watercolor, we have to paint negatively all the time because we have to save the white areas. We don't use white paint. We don't have opaque media. We have to save our white or areas that will then bring in a lighter value to, and that's how we paint. So these letters that you see all around here happen to be there because they just happen to present themselves as the kinds of things that are perfect examples of paint the area around the thing and then reveal the thing. So if we have a shape like this, we'll paint the thing and keep the wet edge moving. And then it goes like this. And then we have a shape here. And a shape here. We're painting the negative areas. We're painting positive shapes. But what we reveal in the end is that we did paint a letter A without really painting it. So negative painting is something that we do all the time with watercolor. We have to. Opaque painters can put down a background and then paint the person or dog or sailboat right over it. We can't do that. So, whoops. So that's the beginning of painting negative shapes, leaving behind the light areas that we'll have to address later, whether they remain white paint or whether they get a light value of another color. And, you know, even here in clouds, we paint the sky, that's a positive shape, but we leave the cloud as a negative shape, right? Paint the shapes that's around the white shape that you want to save. So I have people work on this, and it's a good exercise. It's a challenge. Looking at my notes. Oh, I did want to show you this one thing. Something I learned from Ken Potter, and I just thought I would pass along. If we have a shape that we want to paint a line, this is a little piece of illustration board, mat board, and you can use it to paint or make straight lines. You can just put paint on it and stamp it. And I've seen Ken work out the entire pre-drawing of a painting, just stamping these lines with illustration board. So if you have a bunch of masts or things like that, it's kind of a fun trick to know about. So what else is on my little notes?
Michael, somebody else would like to know if you focus on transparent color only.
For the most part, yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do use gouache a little bit. I'll use a little bit of gouache. I don't know if you can even see it, but there's tiny little white birds in here. And, you know, that's an instance where gouache makes perfect sense. But I really only do paint with transparent watercolor. What Carol was talking about in my first year of art school, we got a little taste of everything in the first year. We learned about painting with oil and painting with acrylic and painting with gouache and with watercolor. I just happened to really take to watercolor that first year. And in my second year of school, I was at another school and I was really struggling. I mean, learning to paint is one thing, learning to paint with opaque and transparent media at the same time is another. And, you know, being 20 years old is another. It's just hard. You're struggling. And I really was captivated by watercolor, but painted with oil and acrylic at school. And I was all confused. And one day I was walking home from school and I had an idea. I thought, I'm just going to take the acrylics and oil paints and put them in the closet. And I did. And that was the end of that. I haven't painted with them since. I just wanted to paint with watercolor. So I saw a question pop up on my phone that said, what is gouache? Gouache is opaque watercolor, and it's a watercolor that is opaque. and it dries a flat finish, but it's water soluble. So if you go over it with another color, it will get wet again. There's another water-based paint that is water insoluble. It's called casein, C-A-S-E-I-N, and that's even used in signage. It's really nice paint. We used to use it in design school for things like this, for letter forms, which we did always. And so casein is a water-based paint. I believe that it's somehow milk-based. I can't remember. And it will dry water insoluble. So one color can be painted over another and the bottom color will not get wet and come up. So let's see, where are we going? Color theory, yeah, color theory's next.
Also, Michael, when painting a cloud with negative space, do you use the same techniques of line and fill? So,
yeah, you do. You do. You're always painting positive shapes. If you paint, if you're painting a cloud, I'll do it on this drawing paper. So you're painting, here's the paper, okay? So you're painting the sky, and then you have to see in your mind's eye where the cloud shapes are going to be and leave them as white paper, you know? But you're always painting positive because your brush can't do anything else, but you're leaving behind those shapes that are going to be clouds, right? So you're painting.
And again, you're following a bead here, so you don't outline the clouds without bringing the sky.
Well, yes, yeah, exactly. You're always doing that. You kind of you have to try to see it in your mind's eye in order to make the cloud. But you're right. Yes, you're still making a wash, and so you have to get across the paper without making a blossom and letting this part dry before you're at that part. And depending on the size of the painting, it can be difficult, but that's what you do. So you're painting with your blue paint, and that's making positive shapes, but you're leaving behind the clouds that are also become, as soon as they're done, they're positive shapes too. They just happen to be white, but you arrived at them by what we call negative painting, right? Clear?
Thank you.
All right, let's see. We're going to talk about color theory. Where's that stuff? Here it is. These can go away. Okay. We can bring this closer. Is everybody all right?
Yes.
Yes, everybody's fine, Michael.
Good. All right, so let's put that there.
Still really not focusing in on the writing, but we can certainly see the colors.
You're supposed
Yeah, and I'm going to say all the words. I'm going to say all the words so you don't have to read them.
out.
Say it again, please. Okay, so we have three colors that are primary colors. And this is a little group of three colors that from which we can make all other colors. But these colors cannot be mixed themselves. They must be found, obtained in some way. And if you want to read about some of the fascinating history of the way that people have found these colors throughout history, I can put some links of really good books in the blog. And so these are called primary colors because of those two things that I just talked about. And they are red, yellow, and blue. And when we mix those colors with each other, we get other colors. When we mix red and blue, we get violet. And when we mix red and yellow, we get orange. And when we mix yellow and blue, we get green. And so those are secondary. Three primaries, 3 secondaries. And then there's a group of color that are tertiary colors, and there's 6 of them, tertiary meaning third. And so they fall between each of the colors that we get from making primaries into secondaries. And they are red violet, blue green, yellow orange, and red orange. Those are the colors. And so with all of these colors, we've made primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries. This gives us a greater range of colors that we can mix. And there is what we call a warm and a cool side to the color wheel. So the warm side of the color wheel, the warm colors, red, orange, and yellow, are the colors that are more like the sun, fire, warm things. The cool side of the color wheel, I never know quite where to put this, whatever. I'd say like that. You know, more like cool forest and blue seas and ice and cool things. They're cool. So that's pretty easy. The warm and the cool side of the color wheel. And that's called color temperature, warm or cool. Each color is warm or cool. So in a classic painting palette, if we were to just have 3 colors, red, yellow, and blue, we'd pretty quickly realize that we had a very limited number of colors that we could mix. And so a classic painting palette has what we call a warm and a cool of each primary. And what that means is that we find certain colors, you know, cadmium red. Here's alizarin crimson. That's my warm and my cool red. And so the way that colors have been discovered and made into paints, they fall into that range of being either warm, cadmium red, or cool, alizarin crimson. And we'll go through the others in a minute. But a warm and a cool of each primary, what that does for us is it greatly extends the range of colors that we can mix, because now we have 2 different kinds of reds, 2 different kinds of yellows, and 2 different kinds of blues. And so what that means is that this red, cadmium red, it has a sense more of the yellow and orange in it. We can see that in the brightness and the warmness of it. And this is something that people kind of struggle with in the beginning. You know, what do you mean? It's a red, it's a warm color. Yeah, but then here's red, and it's what we call a cool color. And it's because we can kind of feel the blue, the violet in this color. You can see that this color has more of the influence of these other cool colors in it. And that would be alizarin crimson. And so for a warm red, we have cadmium red in cadmium yellow in a classic palette. And in a cool yellow, we have lemon yellow. The blues, again, are really so close to one another, but we call cobalt blue our warmer blue because ultramarine blue or French ultramarine blue have, again, more of this influence of the violet in it. So a warm and a cool of each primary is a classic palette, along with earth colors. So here's my palette. I have warm red and cool red, cadmium red, alizarin crimson. Now I happen to have 3 yellows because, as I said at the outset, we never stop talking about yellow color. And we're always exploring new things. And I'll get to this in a minute. I have my warm blue, cobalt blue, and my cool blue, French ultramarine blue. And then I have 4 earth colors: yellow ochre, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and my good friend, raw umber. I choose not to use the 5th earth color, burnt umber, because I find it so close to raw umber. And I really love this color for making muted colors and making grays. If I take some cobalt blue and some raw umber, I have a really quick gray, nice gray. We're going to talk about neutrals and grays in a minute, but that is a quick and easy neutralized color. So I don't use burnt umber, and I try to limit my colors. I'll get to that in a minute. So back to this, I had spoken earlier about how we're always on the hunt for new things and ways to vary our palette. So this color, I don't use cadmium yellow. I use Hansa yellow medium. There's a woman named Jane Blundell in Australia And I was reading her blog 4, 5, 6 years ago, and she described Hansa yellow medium as being right down the line, not cool, not warm, but that makes really good fresh blues. I have greens. I happen to paint a lot of greens because I paint mostly the landscape. So I played with it and I really liked it. For a while, I took lemon yellow off of my palette. I've only just recently put it back, maybe 3, 4, 5 months ago. And it makes really nice greens with cobalt, especially a little bit muddier greens with ultramarine blue. Then just recently, maybe 2 months, 3 months ago, I read an article by a guy who said that yellow, in his estimation, is a keystone color. And that because of that, we should have 3 of them. And he said it's a keystone color because it's involved in every mixture except for violet. Well, in fact, it's actually opposite violet on the color wheel. So that puts it into play with violet in many ways. And so I read his article and I thought, I'm going to try that. So I had put lemon yellow back on my palette and I had Hansa yellow on it, but I played with a couple of the suggestions that he had. And I've been using this one. It's called New Gamboge. And I find that it's useful. It's giving me nice muted greens. So I'm on this little journey of discovery and I'm kind of liking it and probably will keep it at least for a while. But that's what I was saying is that once we kind of get our sea legs with this, we always want to tweak different colors. I've read where this color, alizarin crimson, is being phased out because it's said to be very, what's the word? Not light fast, fugitive. Well, I have too many tubes of it to get rid of right now, but there are substitutes that are coming on the market that are said to be less fugitive. Fugitive means a color that will fade in sunlight. Incidentally, the red colors in general are the only colors that have not been fixed so that they are not fugitive. They are fugitive colors. You must have seen from time to time, you go to a grocery store and there's all those posters taped into the windows. And some look really funny because they've been there 3 or 4 months with the sun shining on them. All the red ink is faded and what's left is the blue and the black and the yellow ink. And so they are fugitive. I've never seen a problem with it. I have a couple paintings upstairs that get sunlight. I have not seen any issues with it. But anyway, so that's my little journey playing with 3 yellows. We have the earth colors, which really are muted primaries in many ways. So yellow ochre is a muted yellow, right? Yellow ochre is a muted yellow. And raw sienna is also a muted yellow. And burnt sienna is a muted red. And raw umber is pretty much a brown color. But as I said, it's a really great color to mute others with. So they're muted primaries, sort of, and we can use them to mute our primaries. So where we saw that when we mix any 2 colors opposite one another on the color wheel, they neutralize one another. They make a neutralized muted color. It's not going to be gray, like battleship gray. It's going to be a color, we'll see in a minute, that it's been muted, but it has a color bias to it. So violet and yellow will cancel one another out or mute. Blue and orange will do the same. Any 2 colors opposite one another on the color wheel will mute one another. But we can also, in addition to muting our primaries with their complementaries, we can mute them also using our earth colors. And earth colors are just that. They're some of the oldest colors in the world. They come from clays and minerals and things that people have found tens of thousands of years ago. If you think about a place like the caves at Lascaux, they were smeared on the walls with earth colors, clays and minerals and things that people dug up, and then burnt sticks that they used for the black. And those are some of the oldest colors. Many are still found and I don't know if it's mined, but dug up in parts of Italy and in the south of France. And so you have the sienna colors, like Siena in Italy, and you have the umber colors, like Umbria in Italy, and that's where they got their names. Most are made chemically, synthesized and made chemically these days, but some still are. And there's a designation you can find on the tube to tell you if the earth color, say yellow ochre, is made from natural materials or synthesized chemically. That is my palette. I like to keep it as simple as I can. I think there's 11 colors here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
No, you don't have green on there.
I do not. No, I don't. I mix greens, and the two colors that I'm replacing here the most are yellows and blues, because I paint mostly the landscape. And so I'm constantly mixing greens, but I like to mix my greens. I have tried most of the tube greens that are available, and I've never really liked any of them. I just prefer to mix my greens. And that is why I'm on this little journey of discovery about another yellow that might help me to mix my greens. On occasion, I'll put Prussian blue here. I just cleaned it off today. I had some on there for a painting, but I don't keep it on there always. And so you have these palettes. I meant to talk about palettes in the first page, but here's a John Pike palette, and it has 20 wells. And I know people who have all 20 wells filled with all kinds of exotic things. And I would rather have fewer colors and really know exactly what I can get from them, so that in the so-called heat of battle and making a painting, I know that I can go to this and this and get X. And so I do try to keep it to a simple classic palette, a couple primaries, warm and cool, and a few earth colors. So that's the way I like to do it, but we're all different. It's
Michael, I
fine.
have somebody asking, what is a muted color?
Muted color, I'm going to show you another sheet in a minute, but a muted color is a color that has been made neutralized or made gray, taken all of the brightness out of it by the mixture with its opposite on the color wheel or with an earth color that will mute it. Just to go over these again quickly, because it was on the sheet that we said we would do. This is a John Pike palette. The lid closes on it. If you put a moist sponge or a paper towel in there, your paints will stay dry for a very long time, stay moist. I have a John Pike palette. I haven't been able to find it for a long time. It's got to be here somewhere. I've been using this thing for a while and it's fine. This is a palette by, I think it's called Mijello, might be Mijello. It's a Korean company. A number of my students use it. This little blue line here is a rubber gasket, so it seals up really well. And that again can keep your colors nice and moist. This is called an Elder John palette. These have been around for a long time. It doesn't close up in any way. Sometimes people will glue two of them together to get more mixing space. I started using this last year at Yosemite because we're out walking and moving around a lot when we paint. And I put away my my John Pike palette, and I just cannot find it. It's got to be here, unless I left it up at the art center, but we'll see. So what are muted colors? Let's just talk about that. So here are some primary colors. Here again is our color wheel. And again, any two colors opposite one another on the color wheel are complementary. And when we mix them together, they neutralize or mute each other. So here we have our primary colors, blue, red, and yellow, mixed with their complements, orange, green, and violet. In this case, they were mixed while they were wet. So I made this little swatch and I brought it down here. And while it was wet, I painted the orange and let them mingle in this area and see what kind of muted color they would make. Same with the red and the green, mixed and allowed to mingle wet here, and the yellow and the violet mixed and allowed to mingle. So they neutralize one another. There's still a color. This feels sort of brownish. This still feels kind of green gray. This feels kind of green, but muted. And so this row were all painted wet. I'll get to these in a minute. In this row, I painted the blue, let it dry, the red, let it dry, and the yellow, let it dry, and then painted their complements over them we see pretty much the same result, only a bigger sample of it, but they're muted. They still have a color bias. They're still a color. We could mute them further by mixing in something that's opposite this. This has a greenish cast to it, so I would mix red into it. So these are painted over one color over another while it's dry, and that's called glazing. When we mix a color over another dry color, we can see through both, and that's glazing color. So we have several ways that we can mix color. We can mix a color in the palette, put it on the paper, and that's that. We can mix color wet and get interesting surprises. That's a second way of mixing color. And a third way is putting down a color and putting another color over it once it's dry, glazing. So this row was glazed. What I did with these two is ultramarine blue with either burnt sienna or burnt umber is a classic 2-color palette. People make entire paintings out of these. And I did these to show, in addition to these, how they would give us neutral colors. And then we can see here what we can do with that. We can make a neutralized color. You can see the red in here in this greenish sky, and the burnt sienna here in this cobalt blue sky. And, you know, we can make it a little winter landscape. So that's how we neutralize colors. Now, what's next? Color index. Yep, that's what I thought. So there is an international organization, the color index code. And this is useful to know about. So in order to have consistency in the color world, and this has to do with dyes and paints for cars and houses and all the things that would normally be used, color would be used in. There's this international agreement about the chemistry and names, more so than numbers that are given to these colors. And so each color has a color code in this index. Let me take this to the board so it doesn't sneak away. And zoom in a bit on it so you can see it more. So now you can read a couple. So we see that this color, Mars Violet, that's its name. It has the international color code P for pigment, B for brown, and the number 7. Here is burnt sienna. You saw it on my palette. P for pigment, BR for brown, number 7, burnt sienna. There it is. Every color has a code. Quinacridone orange, P for pigment, O for orange, number 48. Quinacridone maroon, P for pigment, R for red, number 206. The quinacridone colors were developed in the 1950s for the automobile industry. They've made their way into artists' pigments, and there are a number of them. There's Quin Rose, Quin, everybody loves Quin Gold. There's a lot of them nowadays.
I think we can see it better if you don't move your hand into the picture and let it focus for a minute, maybe.
Okay. So what you can see here is that each color has a designation that is the standard that's agreed to internationally for that color. So burnt sienna is PBR7. We see that, what can you see there? Gold ochre is PY42. So each one has a designation. And this comes from Bruce McAvoy's website, handprint.com, which is an unbelievable resource. That's where I read the article about the 3 yellows. And so I asked him if we could show this tonight, and he said, by all means. So thank you, Bruce. What I also wanted you to see in this, because we talked about it in this other sheet here, is that as these colors, here they're just arranged around a circle, and they're all on the same place on the circle. But in reality, each color has a different intensity. The primary colors are really very intense coming out of the tubes. Some are dark in value, like alizarin crimson, and some are very light in value, and that's just the way they are. the blues are both darker values. And then the earth colors are muted. They're just less intense. And so what this diagram shows really nicely is not only the colors themselves, their international codes, but it shows you the whole circle. And sorry, I'm waving around the circle. But look at how, as the colors come into the center of the circle, we see their relative, what would it be called? How relative they are with respect to being muted or neutrals. You see all the earth colors moving in towards the center. And the theory is that at the center, colors are black. As we saw here.
We can see the colors a lot better if you don't point at them on that chart. If you just tell us what to look at.
Okay. So what we saw here is that they don't just make black when we mix these two complementary colors together. They make a color that has a color bias. However, it's neutralized. And what we see here is very much the same thing, that the earth colors, as we move into the center of the circle, are placed in a way that moves them closer and closer to a neutral dark color. And then he's got black in there in the center, PBK6, carbon black. So that's what I wanted you to see, is each color's relative position given its intensity is the word, or lack of intensity. And so this chart shows that very nicely. And then also tells us what the colors are. And so the question is, so what? You know, what do we care about that? And what I try to do with my palette is to use only what are called single pigment colors. And there are other colors that are made with several pigments, and they're called convenience colors. There are a few on his diagram, but you can find them if you look on websites like Dick Blick. I can show you on the blog how to find them in the website listing for each color. So for me, for my pigment, my palette rather, I have all colors that are single pigment colors. Again, my thing being, I want to know exactly what I can do with each one and know it very well. And I want them to be single pigment colors because I just don't really want to have colors that have more than one pigment in them. They're just less pure, I guess. So this photograph, sorry if I'm wheeling, shows us these three colors, lemon yellow, if I remember, cobalt blue, and alizarin crimson. And you can see in the circle where on the tube in the store, you can find the international color code so you can know what you're buying. And if you don't want, what are they called, convenience colors, then you'll see on there, it might be PB28 and PB14 if it's, I don't know what, you know, cobalt teal. So you can know what you want to do when you buy colors by finding the international color code on the tube. And here's our friend Gum Arabic. So that's that about color and intensities of them and neutrals. So for the person who had that question about what's a neutral color, are you clear now? I hope so.
Yes.
Let me see what I'm doing next.
Michael?
Yeah. Yes.
Are certain colors trademarked? I heard that Tiffany blue is copyrighted, and is that not in the international code?
That I don't know. I really don't know. I never heard of the color Tiffany blue. So I don't know. I couldn't say. Now, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Can a color be copyrighted? There's a new blue that was only discovered about 7 or so years ago. I read about it in Time magazine. It's very intense. And it was, like many colors, discovered by accident. There have been a lot of colors that have been discovered where somebody was trying to find one thing and they found a color. Mauve was one. On my blog post, there's a number of articles about the history of different colors and how they came to be. The country of Brazil is the only country in the world that has ever been named for a tree. And it was named for the Brazil wood tree because the Portuguese found tens and tens and hundreds of thousands of the tree, the Brazil wood tree there, that was very rare in Europe, and the bark of which was used to make a red color. So it was extremely expensive in Europe. And when they discovered Brazil, they found the source of this new product, red color. And it was a huge boost to their economy, and so much so that the country took its name from the Brazil wood tree. So this is what I call my compass for my students. And when I began to teach, I would go around to people's desks and visit with them. And often they would look up and say, okay, what do I do next? And I wanted to think of something that I could do to help students know what they could do next in making a painting. And so often people had struggles with values, with getting a full range of values. And so I thought we could make a simple 5-step value scale. Each person gets one and they paint in the right values. And with that, I wanted to find a single sentence that could keep them on track and help them know how they could move forward. And that sentence is the basics of how we make a watercolor painting, which is that we paint areas and shapes from large and light to small and dark. And so I call this a compass because it can help students guide themselves through a painting. And so here is a typical beginning student painting. And the person has their drawing kind of figured out a bit, but they've got a lot of values, which is a common thing that we see. They've got a lot of values that are either in the light range or very close to one another. We see here that this value is the same as this value and the same as this value. And so this person, the idea of this value scale, this compass, is that people can keep it on their board with their painting, and it can help them to see down the value scale to the entire range and help themselves know, okay, what's my next step? I'm going to paint the next largest shape and down in value until I get to the smallest shapes and the final little calligraphic marks that are generally pretty dark. So everybody gets a compass in the class and is urged to keep it out with their painting. Now, a way that people there's a little mnemonic device that a lot of people use in teaching, and that is that we have, when people begin to paint, they have a hard time knowing, what am I doing in here? I've got this liquid and I'm pushing it around and I don't know what it's going to look like. What value is it going to be? What color is it going to be? And so they have difficulty to know on this white shiny surface what they're getting. And so having a test strip, a piece of watercolor paper that you can test it on, is obviously something that's very helpful. But knowing, we all know the consistency of these everyday things, a cup of tea, a glass of milk, a cream pitcher. And so when we see in our palette that we have something that's about the consistency of tea, we might know that we're at about a light value. And as we go down, if we get more color in there than water, we got to a middle value like this. And then again, a middle dark. So that's something that for people beginning can be helpful to use the consistency of these everyday things and help themselves get their values right. So we begin to make paintings, and one of the things that we want to do, so that is a roadmap, and that's fine. And these are roadmaps too. They're actually more interesting roadmaps because we make them, so we determine the direction we want to go by making these value sketches. And then we follow that roadmap to make the painting. So it's a really good thing to make 4 or 5 or 6 just little sketchy distributions of value. So when we make a composition, when we make a painting, we want to determine where I'm going to put the lights and darks in order to put the viewer's eye where I want it to be, and in order to be an interesting, pleasing organization of the space inside the format. So by making a little series of thumbnails, they don't need to be finished drawings by any means, we can give ourselves a lot of what ifs and then get satisfied with one or maybe even two, and then use it to make the painting. Where'd they go? And so we can make the painting monochromatic or color dominant painting, following the roadmap that we ourselves made in terms of value distribution. And so that's the beginning of designing, making our own designs and getting started with that.
Michael,
yes.
it's getting towards the end of our time, and somebody wanted you to mention again about how to get to your blog.
I will. Let me find that little piece of paper. Here's my blog, and I will have all of these things on it by Friday at around 5 o'clock. I've been a bit busy getting ready for this, but I will put a bunch of the information that is that I've talked about on the blog so that you can see it and use it. I have a few more things that I was going to talk about. I can, or I can stop. It's up to you all. I see that it's 9:01.
I guess it would be fine to have you continue. People just need to know that if it's getting too late for them to stay, that they will be able to get access this through YouTube in about a week or so from our site.
Yeah, even by this Friday, I should get the things up there. But yeah, a couple of days would be fine.
And I do have people saying, don't stop. I'd love to hear more. This is great. So.
Okay, good. One of the things that I like to do with my class is kind of watch what people are doing, look for where they're having trouble with things, and see what I can do to give them handouts that will help to help them figure out where they go next. Sorry about this. Let me get this figured out. That light's too hot.
When you put
So
something
this is
down, when you put something down that you want us to be able to read, the camera's trying to focus on your hands when they go into the picture so that it blurs out the text. So to keep it clear, it would be good to not move your hands around inside of it.
Yes, I know. We came across all these little potholes yesterday. Anyway, this is a handout that I give my students, and there's a lot of information on here, but it's really all about how so much of making a painting, the thinking behind it happens in your palette. There's a lot that goes on there. I'll put a PDF or JPEG of this on the blog, so you don't have to read through it right now. But it also kind of says what this tries to do as well. And that is that, you know, if I was to say to you, where does a painting happen? You might say, well, what kind of question is that? It happens on the paper. And that's true. But really, where a painting ought to happen is in here a lot, in here a lot, and then with all of that thinking and planning with regard to the final marks that the brush will touch the paper on. And when you get right down to it, the brush is really not in contact with the paper all that much, if you think about the entire process of making a painting. And so I would say that we could say that maybe that much of the painting happens in there, and about maybe that much of the painting happens in there, and that maybe about that much of the painting happens in there. you know, more or less. But the point is, and it's the same point of that palette handout, that planning and thinking of a painting is, I think, really where it happens, the most important parts of it. And so that's what that one is all about. Given that, here's a quote by Edgar Degas. The planning of a painting is something which requires as much knavery, trickery, and premeditation as the perpetration of a crime. And then, if he's not enough, let's think about Michelangelo. Michelangelo said, "A man paints with his brains and not with his hands." And I have to be quick to add that we're in the 21st century, and so therefore a woman paints with her brains and not with her hands. But that's the point, is that it's in here mostly that the painting takes shape, or should really. So that's that. I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I touched on earlier, and that is the history of watercolor painting in California. So here's a book, The California Style, that is a compendium. What is it called? I forget the word, begins with an A. An anthology of a regionalist painting movement that took place, what is said to be 1925 to 55 here in California. And it's an absolute treasure of just amazing paintings. And so our website is california.watercolor.org. And there's a website called californiawatercolor.com where you can see a lot of the painters from this movement. It started out of the Chouinard Art Institute in Southern California, in the Pomona area. That school is now part of the Claremont Colleges. What's that brightness? It's part of Claremont Colleges. And a lot of these painters were employed by the Disney studios and did backgrounds and other things for some of the Disney early animated films. So it's a real gem of a book and good to know about. It's out of print. You can find it often on eBay. And I just thought I'd point it out, and also that website where you can see a lot of their work. Here is Ken Potter, who I knew for many years. And also I knew George Post for a brief time. Ken Potter is here. Ken was a real mentor to me, and it was really amazing to know him. There are just so many good painters in here. Here's Robert E. Wood, one of my favorites. So something good to know about this regionalist painting movement that happened here. And that's kind of all I have to say, except for this one thing. For those of you who are beginning, I think we probably had a lot of information, a whole head full of stuff today. But learning to paint with watercolor is not necessarily easy. You have to stick with it. And I have this two Post-it notes right here on the table, on the wall in front of my table, right in front of my nose every day. And I remind myself this. And so I thought I would pass it along because it can be frustrating at times. But it's something that's really worth sticking to and something we can do all of our lives. And so I thought that I would pass that along. And then the other thing is, because it's the holiday season and there's no paint along with this tonight, I thought I would do a video step-by-step of these at Christmas time and the holiday time. We do these wreaths in my class, and we just did them in my Zoom class on Tuesday. So people like to give them out as holiday cards. You can get them copied, photocopied, or printed, or just do all originals. But I'll make a video of this step by step, and then you can follow it along. And an interesting thing about this is when we go back to the 4 ways that we put watercolor paint on paper, these wreaths include every one of them, wet into wet, working the paper as it becomes drier and drier and the marks become harder and sharper to get the texture of the wreath. And we put down little pieces of tape to hold back the berries. We build it up. So they're fun to do and people like to get them. And I'll put that video on there. So that's about it. Thank you all. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
I just want to say thank you. That's a very informative class.
Thank you.
Michael, I do have a question.
Yeah.
I noticed on your palette of colors, you do not have staining colors. Is that correct?
For the most part, that's true. I try to avoid the staining colors a lot. Now, alizarin crimson is said to be a staining color. I've lifted it many times. And the reason that I do try to steer clear of the staining colors is because I lift a fair amount. And I actually meant to show you a little demonstration of lifting. I did this afternoon. So if you have a color, and I'm going to guess that's got alizarin crimson in it there, and you just take clear water and come in here and just gently tickle it with the brush, you can lift it. I don't put other staining colors on my palette because I do lift from time to time. And I want to be able to do that. Now, here's another thing. I lifted this little piece this afternoon, playing around with it. So you can take tape and put it down. And if you need to lift a fence post or something that you painted over by accident, I use this little bristle brush. It's a stippling brush. And you can really get that back to white paper pretty quickly with this thing. So yes, by and large, I don't use staining colors because I do lift and it's good to do. I meant to read you the properties of the colors. They're either staining or opaque. No, they're not, none are opaque per se, but more than others. This is Winsor yellow. The Winsor and Newton colors have a series. There's Winsor yellow, Winsor red, Winsor blue, and Winsor green. And if it says Winsor on the label, that means that it's the pigment is phthalocyanine and it's extremely staining. And sometimes you'll see a paint tube from another company. It'll just say phthalo blue. But that's one of the most staining colors. Prussian blue is also, and I don't know, but Prussian blue might be made with phthalocyanine. But yeah, by and large, I steer clear of the staining colors. Any other questions? Granulating colors. Granulating is another property of the colors, and I love that. I love when the color settles into the hills and valleys of the paper. I don't know where I just put that little painting, but I use French ultramarine blue exclusively. So if you see in a store ultramarine blue and French ultramarine blue, the French will be very sedimentary or granulating. The regular without the word French in front of it will not be. And I always use French because I love the way it settles into the paper. I don't know where I put those things. Anyway.
So you'll be posting a video of the way you make the Christmas wreaths on your blog?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great, great.
Yep.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, a lot to try out, a lot to put into practice and play with.
Good.
Tonight.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a lot of stuff. I have these little notes that my classes are generally 4-week chunks. And I was looking at them, and what we've done tonight is about 3 weeks worth of basic info, but with, of course, in person, the students having a lot of time to practice things, and then we do a paint along, but it's about 3 weeks worth of intro stuff. I should also say, I forgot to say at the beginning, that Carol and I have been working about having an in-person beginning watercolor class, and we will. We got a place for it at Heather Farm, and we got all the little details figured out, and we were just about to start this spring. And then, of course, the shelter in place came along. But we will do it.
We were really close on that. I was telling Joe and I have had a little bit of a side discussion about this, Michael. So there's going to be some opportunities coming up. So
yeah, good. No,
this is important. There's so much information, and you have given us tonight so much that for even when I first started out, you have supplied us with so much information that I didn't learn for a long time when I first started in watercolor. So there is so much that people who want to get involved need to know to give them that comfort zone. And it's something that I think that California Watercolor Association is going to be able to get supply.
Yeah, we'll do it for sure. We just have to get back to life the way we all like it, and that'll happen. We'll do it. And currently, I do have a class on Tuesdays with Zoom. It's at Falkirk Cultural Center, but of course, we're all at home. And I've had an in-person class since the beginning of August. We're allowed to have limited people, 12, and we were outdoors until November, all spaced out in a beautiful wedding lawn area there. But we will definitely get the CWA beginners class going. Joe and I talked about it this morning as well. So the other thing about a class is that once you go over these fundamentals and people have a chance to practice them in person, and then you can do things that are a little bit more challenging, like a paint along toward the end of the class that people can, kind of try out their new skills with. And that's what we're doing with the Falkirk classes, both Zoom and the in-person one, which is tomorrow morning. We did these, where did I put it? We did these, I do these things to play around, these big sky things where I just throw a ton of color onto the page and move it around and see where it settles, and then decide how to make a landscape out of the lower part of it. And we threw some salt on there, which I kind of regretted a little bit afterwards, but I thought I could take little dots of white gouache and turn them into stars so it looks like they're shining. And then I took my little toothbrush and spritzed some white up there. And then we painted the wreath. So here's Tuesday, here's Thursday from another week. So we do paint alongs, and they help everybody with the skill building that are the fundamental things that we talk about.
Michael, somebody's asking if you have any upcoming Zoom classes at Falkirk.
Yes, on Tuesdays, every Tuesday. I can send them a link. Who's asking? I can send them a link to where they can sign up. It's Tuesdays from 10 to 12. And we always paint from 10 to 1 because that's what it takes. We schedule it as a 2-hour class because we weren't sure how long the phone battery would work when I was using my phone.
Michael, maybe it would be helpful if you put that on for people who wanted to do that you put it on your blog.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay.
Wonderful. So unless there's more questions, I'm going to start wrapping tonight's meeting up. Any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank
Michael.
you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
People have put in a lot of comments about how much they've gotten out of this demonstration.
This is Joan Cohen speaking. I enjoyed your class very, very much. You're a fabulous painter. Thank you.
Thank you.
So generous of you, Michael. Thank you.